I think that the social trend that will follow on from sea change and tree change in the 2000s is a concept that I call downshifting. And this will apply to baby boomers in their late 50s and 60s. Sell your house that you bought in Hornsby in 1978 for $45,000 that's now worth $1.8 million. Sell that, buy an apartment down the coast at, say, Mollymook for $750,000, go on a world trip, help your kids into the property market. In other words, extract the equity in your suburban home in a major capital city, primarily Sydney and Melbourne, and use that to leverage lifestyle. The problem is that once you make that transition, you can never go back to the Kingdom of Sydney once you have left, cashed your chips in and moved out. I think that this is a major shift that we'll see baby boomers embrace over the next decade, largely because they haven't saved enough to live the sort of retirement they will want. And I'm still predicting that will be up and down the eastern seaboard. In fact, the biggest influence on the property market is each of those generations. They pretty much span the population between 20 and 60, and this is the productive, household forming, house buying population. But each of them specialise in different markets. The baby boomers over the last decade have been upscaling, trading up, also buying investment property and sea change property. What we will see over the next decade is this concept of downshifting that I've referred to. Generation Y, of course, famously live at home with their mum and dad well into their 20s. They're known as kippers, K-I-P-P-E-R-S, kids in parents' pockets, eroding retirement savings. So we'll see the kippers finally leave home and move into apartmentia, into the inner city largely, and live as singles or couples. Ultimately, later in the 2010s, they'll move into more standard sort of housing, typically in the growth areas. And Generation X, people in their late 30s and 40s, are trading up. People tend to buy their most expensive property in their life in their late 30s and 40s. So it's Generation X. If you've got a good property, then you should be pitching it at Generation X over the next decade. Australians have embraced suburbia for 100 years. We love our backyards, our 3-bedroom brick veneers, our barbecue area, the hills hoist in the middle of the backyard. But unfortunately, the reality is that that is a concept that belongs to the 20th century. In the 21st century, certainly in our major cities, the backyard is shrinking. We simply cannot afford that amount of space. And also with mum and dad working, then there's really no one at home during the day, so you don't need as much space out in the burbs. What we're now seeing is the rise of something that is closer to the type of housing mix you'd see in other world western cities and communities. We are seeing the rise of apartmentia. Now this does not have to be Manhattan high-rise, although in parts of Melbourne and Sydney you actually do have that, but it's simply a denser form of living. Townhouses, units, 2 or 3 story walk-up apartments, and we'll see that certainly on the CBD fringe and inner suburbs, but increasingly over the next decade I think we'll see the advance, like the creeping tentacles of apartmentia encroaching into suburbia along railway corridors. And so the sort of places I would be looking at would be areas within walking distance of suburban railway stations between, say, 10 and 20 kilometres out from the CBD. These areas would be hot prospects for makeovers or redevelopment by developers over the next 10 or 15 years, or in fact simply highly prized by people who want an apartment and then to commute to work. That's certainly an area of apartment expansion I'd see over the next decade. I see housing affordability as a major social issue for the next decade. I'd also see it as a major political issue. If you look at the underlying demographic change in Australia expected over the next decade, there will be a significant increase in the 30-something population. 30-somethings move into household formation. You can't live with mum and dad at 30. You've got to actually get out there and get an apartment or a house. And what we have seen over the last decade is sort of this dull murmuring complaint, if you like, from Generation Y about lack of affordability. I think that will turn into a raging tsunami in the coming decade. Generation Y simply not being able to afford the entry level into certainly a Sydney or Melbourne, perhaps even southeast Queensland property market. Affordability, to my way of thinking, is a house and land package, say under $300,000. And before you gasp about that, there are places in Australia where you can get that. Certainly the northern suburbs of Adelaide, the western suburbs of Melbourne, Werribee and Melton, you can get house and land packages under $300,000. So I think that there is a challenge on for many metropolitan markets, particularly Sydney, southeast Queensland and Perth, to deliver affordable housing in the 2010s for their local Gen Y communities. And we'll make it easier. They need to be under $350,000 in order to be categorised, I think, as affordable by modern standards.